Greeting Com 600, this is Ben Fraser. Just wanted to take a Friday and go over the short stories I promised I would of Flannery O'Connor. I've talked enough about her. I won't be spending a whole lot of time, or barely any time, about her so much as the meaning of the three stories that I assigned for you to read a couple weeks ago. They come from this book. Well, there's several books, but they're all collected into one large book called Flannery O'Connor, The Complete Stories. If you're going to buy something of hers, this is the book to buy. It's excellent stories for you to read if you like her type of writing. The first story we're going over is called A Good Man is Hard to Find. And the interesting thing in this story is there's no hero. Most stories have a character that you can identify with. And in this case, you have two very unlikely and unlikable characters. You have mainly the grandmother. Of course, there's her son and his wife and the grandchildren. And then there's the misfit and his buddies. But the two key characters in the whole story revolve around this grandmother, who is a cultural Christian of some type. She thinks she's a very good Christian, but she is a very domineering, selfish, narcissistic lady who is living with her son, who does everything really to disrupt the family, and maybe not intentionally, but certainly she is not really aware that she is disrupting. They're going on a vacation. She invites herself to, or decides to go with them. They say, do not take the cat. She smuggles the cat into the car, and the cat, in fact, is part of the reason why the car ends up in the ditch. And then once in the ditch, then she meets the misfit, who is a serial killer, not a very likable character either. And then, and so the story leads up to this encounter. Well, her son and her daughter-in-law and the children are marched off to the woods to be killed. The grandmother and the misfit have this fascinating conversation. Now, so these aren't lovable characters. They're not characters that you even want to identify with. So what is she doing here? She is providing an opportunity to ask deep questions. She's not trying to comfort. She's trying to disturb. She's trying to awaken a world that is deaf to the truth of Jesus Christ. And the interesting thing here, and the juxtaposition, is she puts much of the gospel message into the mouth of the misfit, the serial killer, who does not believe in God, who is angry at God, who's aware of who Jesus is, but doesn't believe in him. And by doing so, she gains a larger audience among people in the United States. And then there's this conversation and discussion. Now, two things about Flannery O'Connor that are true of every story. One, she takes sin seriously, and you can see in here that that sin is taken seriously. Second is that she offers grace at some moment, almost imperceptibly, in every story, and it's there if you look for it in the misfit, offered to the misfit and to the grandmother, accepted by the grandmother. You remember in the story at the very end, it says her mind clears for a minute. Now, they've been having this discussion about Jesus, who the misfit says throws everything off balance. And wedged in there are these disturbing but profound questions. And I've had so many conversations with people that say, we love her because they just disturb me. And I go back to that story again, I read it again, and it just, for some reason, it captures their imagination. And they say it doesn't comfort, but it forces them to begin to deal with things in their own life. What place does Jesus have? What place does God have? Is there justice in the world? As the misfit is saying, all the punishment I have doesn't fit all the bad that I've done. And so these very profound, important questions about the self and the meaning of life and who we really are in this world are found there in this very brief but disturbing story. She is trying to provoke the individual, the modern individual, to think about issues, ultimate issues of God and reality and purpose in life and those dimensions. And so at the end of the story, when the son is gone to the woods, she hears the shots. The grandmother is begging in sense for her own life. And then Flannery O'Connor writes these words, and I just want to, if I can find them here, read them to you. She says, he says first, he says, if I would have known and been there, I would have known who he was like and what he was. And so he's saying the question, if I just would have been there when Jesus was there, I would have known, and I would have been a different person. And of course, that's not true. That's a false idea. That even the disciples deserted Jesus at the last minute. Most of the people who were there, who lived with Jesus, did not understand who he really was, did not defend him, and allowed him to go to the cross by himself. And then it says, her mind cleared for an instant, and this is the grandmother, and she saw the man's face twisted close to her own, as if he was going to cry. And she murmured, why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out and she touched him on the shoulder. The misfit, of course, springs back and shoots her in the chest 3 times. And so we have this very ugly, difficult scene. But here's what happens. In that last moment of her life, just like the thief on the cross, she steals into heaven. This grandmother who was narcissistic, who was selfish, who was bossy, who is responsible really for many of the problems within that family. And we all know people like this, who as they grow older, they don't grow more comfortable or more kind, but grow more bittered and rigid. And she was one of those kinds of people. So this is not a person you want to identify with. But yet in that last moment, what happened in that last moment? Well, first, the clue is, for Flannery, she says her mind cleared. Her mind cleared. What's that mean? She began to see the image of God in the other. That there is no one in this world that is out of the opportunity to accept and to know who Christ is, even the shocking, unfair, in some ways, serial killer, misfit. And she recognizes in finally seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, that they are related because they both are bearers of the image of God. He, of course, bears it and denies it and rejects it and isn't obedient to that at all. She has not really been a much better character, and yet in the last moment, she steals into heaven and accepts the relationship that she can have with Christ. And the interesting thing here is, and what Flannery is showing us, is that immediately when we become a Christian, it does not only affect our relationship with God, but it affects our relationship with everyone else, with other people, no matter who they are, our friends and our enemies. And we begin to see them as brothers, as related, as bearers of God's image. And she sees that, and she makes the offer then to the misfit who rejects it. Interesting thing right after that, Flannery says her legs were crossed under her like a child's. How do we come to Christ? Like a child. And her face was smiling up at a cloudless sky. Difficult ending. Not every time when a person comes to Christ is it all roses and chocolate and wonderful. Sometimes we come to Christ and we still have to have our legs broken as the thief on the cross. We still suffer, as Flannery herself was suffering from lupus and ultimately died at 39. The interesting thing too is the comment by the misfit, who says in the next to the last line, she would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. So that in that last moment, in that desperate moment when push comes to shove, she ultimately made the right decision. And so the beauty of this story and the power of this story is raising disturbing questions that need to be addressed in the heart and the mind of the reader. And that is the modern reader. So it's not the kind of thing you're going to go to church and get a nice, comfortable message and everything's going to turn out wonderful at the end. In a way, it is wonderful that she made the choice to live for Christ, and not so wonderful for the misfit, but in another sense, there's still consequences to the actions she have. And that leads us to the next story. The lame shall enter first. And if I just want to say about that story is it really can be read on 4 levels. The first level is just a very interesting story of a man whose wife died recently, and he's suffering and dealing with that, and he has trying to raise as a single parent a son, and then in his grief he tries to reach out to other people, and he reaches out by spending some of his off time helping at a juvenile delinquent center. He meets this very smart but juvenile delinquent called Rufus, who has a club foot, represents his brokenness. And so in the story, we just see that the relationship there, and it's just a fascinating story. On the second level, Flannery, reading that story, you can see the importance of the psychological states that each one is. Rufus, who is this rough kid, bad background. Shepherd, who is the father, who probably is in denial in some sense. And then his son, Morton, who is just a 10-year-old who wants his mother back and doesn't understand why. So we have the psychology of all that. But I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining that. But I do want to explain another level. And that is, we see here Flannery O'Connor giving a very powerful critique of modernity. And how, you say, is that? Well, Shepherd doesn't believe in revelation. He doesn't believe in the Bible. He doesn't believe in spirituality. He doesn't believe in God. So when his wife dies, that's it. She's dead. And it's Rufus, the juvenile delinquent, when he comes to live with them, who tells Shepherd's son about heaven and about your mom still somewhere. And then the son, of course, who just wants his mother back and is in grieving. And you can see Shepherd as not really meeting the real needs of the son, but meeting the needs he thinks the son should have. And what does he think? Science. So he buys him a telescope. Or he tries to get Rufus a different shoe for his foot. Or it's education, and he really wants him to read the book. And then he's totally angry because Rufus goes out and steals a book, and the book is the Bible, and reads the Bible to the son, and he's glad because he wants both of them to read, and he thinks education will help them, but then he's reading the Bible, and so it creates this juxtaposition that's totally untenable. And all these things, science, education, reason, all those things, belief in things are going to get better, all fail for Shepherd finally. And in the very end of the story, he is awakened to the fact that he has been wrong, and he has been loving this other person even more than his own son, and his own words really condemn him. And he realizes this too late. He is offered grace at that moment. He accepts it, runs upstairs to love his son in the way he should have been loving him all along. And what happens? His son has committed suicide. His son's died. So here we see, in a very stark and powerful way, a critique of what modernity offers. Reason above revelation, science and technology will save us, the power of education. We don't have to talk about sin. We don't have to talk about evil and those kinds of things, except in a modernist sense. And so that's what we see. Now, I don't have time to go in this video into the last story, so I'll maybe do that another time. But anyway, hopefully these 2 stories will help you. God bless. Have a good day.